There was a time in America, not that long ago, when life was simpler on the surface but heavier underneath. A time when ordinary moments held extraordinary meaning, when bacon grease was saved like treasure, blackout curtains hung like armor, and Christmas lights felt stronger than fear. Kids learned patience from ration books, hope from radio voices, and courage from watching brothers board trains without promises of return. The war didn't stop life. It wove itself into every hallway, every kitchen, every backyard. And the things we remember from the 1940s aren't grand events. They're the small, forgotten details that shaped an entire generation. A world that is unthinkable now, but was normal then. Every goodbye in the 1940s began with brown leather suitcases tied shut with string. You'd carry them to the train platform, pretending to be strong, pretending you weren't scared, pretending adulthood didn't arrive all at once. Hugs were short, words were small, and when the train rolled away, the silence it left behind was louder than the whistle. Christmas wasn't extravagant. It was sacred. Colored bulbs burned hot like tiny fire embers. Real lead tinsel hung heavy like silver snow, and stockings smelled like oranges, ribbon candy, pine, and sugar. You didn't need piles of gifts. All you prayed for was the same faces around the tree again next year. Mom scraped bacon grease into an old tin can, like she was adding coins into a vault. Wartime gold disguised as kitchen leftovers. Kids didn't ask questions. They just believed that even breakfast could help boys come home sooner. Victory gardens were more than vegetables. They were duty planted in soil. Every tomato, every pea, every marigold meant one less ration coupon used, and that tiny little act made you feel like you were part of something enormous. Nighttime meant gathering around the radio, the warm glow of the dial coloring the room in quiet amber. FDR didn't sound like a politician. He sounded like a neighbor leaning in the doorway, asking you to hang on just a little longer, with steadiness that felt like peace. Blackout shades smothered the windows like shields. Streets dimmed. Houses went silent. Kids learned how danger could live in whispers, without the adults ever saying the word danger. Nothing got thrown away. Not string, not foil, not jars, not paper. Everything had another purpose waiting in the shadows. Recycling wasn't an environmental slogan. It was a survival reflex burned into instinct. The milkman arrived before the sun, leaving glass bottles sweating cold on wooden porches. Cream rose thick to the top, and siblings argued for first pour like it was luxury. That tiny daily argument meant the world was still human. Church basements became soft factories of hope. Knitting needles clicking in slow rhythm, turning yarn into warmth for boys who might be freezing somewhere oceans away. No applause, no announcements, just silent faith stitched into every inch. And when the news finally spread that peace had arrived, nobody screamed with fireworks or victory parades. They just stopped, breathed deeper, and let relief settle into their bones like something fragile they didn't want to startle. The war ended, not with noise, but with quiet gratitude. Sugar wasn't something you wasted. It was guarded like treasure. One cup could change the mood of the whole house. Moms measured with the precision of surgeons, leveling spoons like seconds of time. Kids learned early that sweetness wasn't a habit. It was a privilege. Birthdays didn't always come with real frosting. Applesauce, molasses, or mashed potatoes became the secret ingredient that saved the celebration. You nodded while chewing, pretending it tasted exactly like the real thing. Because in the 1940s, imagination was half the flavor. When chocolate finally returned, it felt like the entire country was celebrating at once. A single square on your tongue was a national victory. Candy wasn't just candy. It was proof the world was inching back toward normal again. Coffee brewed like dark thunder. Bitter, strong, heavy, a morning ritual thick enough to brace your spirit for the day. No tiny flavor syrups, no whipped dreams, just a black cup of reality that everyone accepted without complaint. The root cellar wasn't spooky. It was survival. Cool dirt, jars lining dusty shelves, peaches and pickled beets waiting for winter like soldiers at attention. You whispered down there without knowing why, as if preserved food demanded respect. Cracker Jack boxes were lottery tickets disguised as snacks. You didn't buy them for caramel. You bought them for the mystery prize buried inside. A tiny ring could make you king of the block for a day. A paper puzzle could ruin your mood for hours. Grocery lists were scribbled on scraps of envelopes and old newspaper margins. You bought only what stamps allowed, not what craving demanded. Even the smallest bag of flour came with choices attached: sacrifice or celebration. Soda wasn't grabbed from refrigerators. It was opened with a church key, a cold bottle sweating in your hand, the sharp crack of metal meeting glass. Foam on your lip meant you were lucky that day. Fresh bread could make the whole house pause. The smell drifting through the kitchen was enough to make the war feel a little further away. Bread wasn't a side dish. It was comfort itself. And when the rare real cake showed up, birthday, homecoming, or miracle, nobody rushed. Nobody grabbed. Everybody savored each bite like it was the last sweet moment the world could afford to give them. Hand-me-downs weren't a sign of struggle. They were a badge of continuity. Older brother's shirts, cousin's jacket, neighbor's sweater. Clothes carried stories before they ever carried your weight. You didn't ask where they came from. You simply made them your own. Flour sack dresses weren't embarrassment. They were brilliance stitched into fabric. Moms turned those patterned sacks into Sunday outfits with mismatched buttons and tiny hand-pressed details. And nobody laughed, because half the room wore the same beauty. Patches weren't emergency repairs. They were routine life. Some sewn on before the knees even tore. Old shirts became new squares. Curtains became elbow covers. Scraps became second chances. And no one ever threw away cloth that still had work left in it. Sewing machines echoed like heartbeat in the corner of the house. The rhythmic clunk of the pedal, the needle bouncing like it had a mind of its own. Grandma didn't talk much when she worked, but every thread she pulled felt like another stitch holding the whole family together. Shoes lasted seasons longer than they should have. Soles were glued, laces replaced, heels hammered back into shape. You didn't beg for new ones. You stretched the life out of what you had, and somehow you made it enough. Coats lived multiple lives. Linings replaced, sleeves shortened, buttons borrowed from forgotten drawers. Nothing was waste. Everything waited for a second roll. Sometimes a third. Even rags had a hierarchy. The good ones stayed in the kitchen. Torn ones became Polish cloths for Sunday shoes. The worst ones still earned duty, soaking grease, wrapping surprises, padding sharp edges. Nothing went to the trash bin until it had nothing left to offer. Hats hung by the door like guardians, fedora, cap, brim creased from weather and work. Men removed them for respect without thinking twice. The gesture wasn't style. It was identity written in motion. Laundry day wasn't a chore. It was a ritual. The wringer washer hummed like machinery of industry. Shirts emerged flat and perfect, ready for the line outside, sun bleaching away the week without costing a single cent. And when clothing finally reached the point of no return, it didn't die. It transformed into quilts, doll clothes, pot holders, rags, patches, until every single thread had given everything it possibly could. Barefoot summers weren't rebellion. They were normal life. Feet toughened by gravel, splinters, and sun-baked sidewalks. You learned the world through texture, not warnings. And nobody told you to put shoes on, unless snow was falling. The alleyways behind houses were kingdoms of imagination. You knew every fence gap, every shortcut, every dog that barked more than bit. Streets weren't danger zones. They were home, wide open, unfiltered, and unmonitored. Scrap drives weren't chores. They were missions. You dragged bent pans, rusted rakes, twisted bed springs stacked in wagons, believing every squeaky wheel helped win the war. Kids felt like soldiers without ever leaving the neighborhood. Firecrackers turned 4th of July into heart-racing adrenaline. You lit the fuse, sprinted, and prayed it didn't explode early. Sometimes it fizzled. Sometimes it roared. But that pop of cheap fireworks was worth every scraped knee and racing heartbeat. Chalk turned sidewalks into maps of fantasy. Hopscotch grids, treasure paths, battlefields drawn with dusty white streaks. Rain erased entire worlds overnight, but that just meant tomorrow had new ones waiting. Roller skates strapped over regular shoes with metal buckles that pinched your ankles raw. You wobbled down cracked pavement like a daredevil in training. If something snapped mid-ride, Dad's wrench fixed it faster than any store could. Boards, crates, and leftover nails were toys before toys came from stores. You could build a pirate ship in the backyard or a lemonade stand in the driveway with wood that wasn't meant for any of it, and somehow it still worked. Storm drains became adventure tunnels. Kids crawled inside with flashlights in courage they didn't have names for yet. It didn't feel like trespassing. It felt like secrets only you discovered. A pocket knife handed down wasn't danger. It was responsibility. Metal with a history of hands before yours. You didn't brag about it. You just slipped it in your pocket and felt older, and wind wasn't just air, it was freedom. You stuck your hand out the car window, letting the breeze lift your palm like an airplane wing. That simple motion made you believe summer never ended, and the world was bigger than any map could show you. Radio wasn't background noise. It was the center of gravity in the house. Families gathered close, faces lit by the soft glow of the dial, listening to voices build entire worlds out of nothing but sound. You didn't watch stories, you imagined them, filling every silence with your own private movie. Newsreels before feature films felt like you were peeking directly into history. Grainy tanks, flags rising, victory marches, dictators shouting from balconies half a world away. Kids didn't catch every meaning, but they understood enough to sit up straighter. Movie stars weren't celebrities, they were royalty. Bogart, Ball, Cary Grant, as familiar as relatives but larger than life. Their smiles felt personal, their lines felt magical, and when they stepped onto the screen, it didn't feel like watching actors. It felt like being chosen. Fantasia didn't feel animated, it felt supernatural. The music roared like thunder, the colors moved like living spirits, and that broomstick nightmare gripped every child for days afterward. Disney wasn't cartoons yet, it was sorcery. Crystal radios were pure engineering miracles to kids, not toys. Boys twisted wires like treasure maps, trying to catch signals from somewhere beyond imagination. Girls clipped comic strips and headlines, preserving history before it even became history. Magazines like Life didn't get skimmed. They got devoured one photograph at a time. War scenes, inventions, movie premieres, fashion cover art, bigger than anything the real world felt like. The coffee table became a time machine every time a new issue arrived. Howdy Doody appearing on a neighbor's tiny television felt like witnessing the future crash into the living room. Kids leaned in, adults whispered, someone fixed the antenna, and a block full of people shared the same laugh inside the same moment in time. Comic books were 10-minute vacations from ration cards and real worries. Dick Tracy, Little Orphan Annie, Gasoline Alley. Each story gave your brain permission to be a kid again, even if only for the length of one speech bubble. Propaganda posters weren't decorative, they were guiding scripture of the era. Loose-lipped sink ships wasn't simply a warning, it was a feeling, a moral code printed in bold ink that every child instinctively absorbed. And the morning paper hitting the porch with that solid thump meant the world outside your front door had changed again. And you were about to find out how, one folded page at a time. The milkman knew every house, every dog, every kid on the block. Glass bottles clinked softly against each other in the early morning quiet. Cream rising to the top like winter snow. You didn't need apps or receipts. Trust and routine handled the math. The butcher, the barber, and the grocer weren't just businesses. They were part of your family's weekly rhythm. You didn't price compare with strangers. You walked into the same shop, with the same smell, and the same man behind the counter who already knew what cut your mother preferred. Factories didn't feel like machines. They felt like duty. Men and women punched in, packed lunches in dented metal pails, and worked in steady rhythm because every shift felt tethered to someone far away, wearing a uniform. The schoolhouse wasn't a district. It was a community in one small wooden box. 3 rooms, 1 bell, 1 teacher who somehow juggled every grade without losing her patience. Spitballs, chalk dust, spelling bees. Education felt like a living thing, not a system. Teachers wrote cursive like artwork, perfect loops, perfect tails, perfect pressure. You didn't get scolded for spelling mistakes first, you got scolded for sloppy penmanship. Beautiful writing meant respect for the word itself. Inkwells sat at the top of desks like relics, no longer used, but still holding tiny treasures, marbles, pennies, buttons, candy. The wood smelled like old trees and time, and kids carved initials in sharp corners as proof they once existed there. Newsboys sprinted through streets before the presses cooled, shouting headlines like town criers from another century. Coins clinked into their hands without bargaining. People needed to know what the world was doing faster than their own hearts could process it. Post offices hummed like nerve centers of the entire small-town map. Letters traveled slower than emotion, but carried more weight than any phone call ever could. You opened them carefully, like opening someone's soul. Nickel sodas and penny candy weren't treats. They were economic miracles. A handful of coins meant a real choice. Something you rarely got in a world where most choices were made by circumstances you couldn't see. And every job, barber, grocer, teacher, iceman, switchboard operator, felt sacred. Not because they paid wealth, but because they held the country together while the world outside kept trying to tear itself apart. Train stations were emotional battlegrounds long before airports ever were. You stood there small, holding a comic book, not knowing how to say goodbye to someone taller, older, braver than you. Uniforms looked shiny and heroic on the platform, but they faded into frightening distance the second those train doors shut. Tiny train tickets came in little envelopes that felt more valuable than money. Thick paper, ink smell, soft edges. Even if you were only riding 3 towns over, it felt like crossing a continent. Travel back then carried weight because distance actually meant distance. Telegram deliveries froze time. A simple knock, and every heartbeat in the house stopped. One thin paper could mean relief or devastation. Adults read them in silence. Kids watched without understanding. But they never forgot the tension in the room. Long-distance calling wasn't casual conversation. You didn't just dial a number. You asked the operator. She recognized voices. She connected lives by hand. Every word cost something real, so people chose speech carefully. Not to waste breath, not to waste seconds. Road trips weren't escapes from routine. They were the routine. Windows down, elbow into someone's ribs, the hum of tires on old pavement. You drove slow. Not because speed limits forced you, but because time felt worth more than the destination. Holding your hand out the window was the cheapest form of flight ever invented. Your palm cutting the air like an imaginary wing. No rules, no fear, just the pure, free belief that the future could be bigger than what you could see. Stations smelled like metal, diesel, steam, tobacco, and anticipation all at once. Every goodbye there carved a silent wound. Every return through the same station stitched part of the world back together again. When a soldier returned home unexpectedly, there wasn't screaming or fireworks or speeches. There was a soft knock on the door, and then a mother collapsing into him with relief she didn't know how to express out loud. Nobody asked what those boys saw overseas. Nobody asked what they survived. They just poured a cup of coffee, set an extra plate, and held eye contact a second longer than normal. Because that was the only language that felt safe. And years later, the memory of boots stepping back onto home soil still felt louder than gunfire ever could. Silence became the celebration, breath became the victory, and home finally felt like home again. Rotary phones weren't a convenience. They were an event. One phone in the hallway, long cord twisted like a rope, every conversation shared by default. You dialed slow, one click at a time, listening to the wheel spin back like it was measuring your patience. A pocket knife wasn't rebellious. It was responsibility. Grandpa gave it to Dad, and Dad handed it to you like passing a torch. Scratched blades, stiff hinge, faint smell of old tobacco. You didn't brag. You just carried it, and suddenly you felt 3 years older. Church keys hung on nails near the back door. Cold metal tools that popped the caps off soda bottles with a single sharp crack. No twist-offs, no shortcuts. That sound meant refreshment was earned, not dispensed. The wringer washer wasn't a machine. It was a survival engine. You fed shirts through the rollers like a factory worker, terrified your fingers might get too close. Clothes came out flat as boards, ready for the line. The whole house smelled like soap, sun, and honest labor. Kerosene lamps hummed and flickered like living fire. They weren't vintage decoration. They were necessity in the places electricity hadn't reached yet. Those soft amber lights made rooms feel smaller, safer, and strangely more alive. Wooden crates weren't trash behind stores. They were potential. Pirate ships, lemonade stands, treehouse steps. You nailed them together even when they didn't fit. Splinters were trophies earned from pure imagination. Switchboard operators were the living internet. They knew who was home, who wasn't, who called who twice a day. If they liked you, they connected faster. If not, patience was your only option. Metal lunch pails took punches in factories and schoolyards, steel dented by work and weather. Inside, a sandwich wrapped like treasure, a pickle, maybe a folded note. Those boxes held more daily life than any insulated container ever could today. Train tickets were printed on thick cardstock, tiny, fragile, yet somehow sacred. You held them like you were holding destiny itself, even if you were only riding to the next county over, and nothing, not even string, was useless. String drawers existed in every home. Twine, ribbon, thin rope, bits and ends. Saved because one day, tomorrow or next year, it would be exactly what solved a problem no store could fix in time. Neighbors didn't need invitations to help. They simply showed up. Someone's husband shipped out. The entire block quietly filled the gaps without ever saying the word help. It wasn't charity. It was instinct. War bond posters hung in windows like prayers printed on paper. Lady Liberty, bold colors, stern warnings. You didn't need to understand economics. You just knew dropping in a dime meant pushing the world 1 inch closer to peace. Knitting circles filled church basements with the sound of soft conversation and clicking needles. Moms, grandmas, sometimes even dads, stitching socks and scarves that traveled further than any of them ever would. Every thread carried silent hope for a boy they might never meet. Scrap drives turned the town square into a tidal wave of metal. Rusted rakes, broken pans, bed springs, busted pots, piled high like trophies of collective belief. Kids moved wagons like generals guiding an army of junk toward victory. Ration coupons weren't hoarded selfishly. They were traded with grace. Sugar for meat, coffee for butter, quiet nods, no paperwork, no scoreboard. People understood that survival was a shared equation. Gossip wasn't entertainment. Stories carried weight. The butcher, the barber, the grocer, they all had the same history tucked away behind their eyes. They didn't brag about what they'd seen, but you could hear the war echo in every pause. Church bells meant something. Weddings, funerals, and sometimes peace. When they rang unexpectedly, strangers embraced each other like family, because suffering tied everyone together long before victory did. A neighbor's porch swing was community seating. Kids sat on steps, adults leaned against rails, trading news, quiet concerns, small laughter. The world outside was uncertain, but that small wooden porch felt like neutral ground. Nobody spoke about fear directly, but everyone felt it together. The unspoken unity was stronger than any treaty or speech could define, and when one soldier finally returned home, the entire street exhaled like a single body holding breath for far too long. Relief didn't belong to one family. It belonged to every window, every mailbox, every porch on the block. Pie cooling on the windowsill wasn't decoration. It was invitation. Apple, rhubarb, peach, it didn't matter. You could smell it from half a block away. Kids lingered nearby, pretending they weren't waiting, but everyone knew exactly why you were there. One thin slice made the whole day feel softer. Bedtime didn't belong to silence. It belonged to whispers. 3 siblings in one bedroom, sharing blankets, stealing pillows, arguing in hushed voices about nothing important. Someone always snored. Someone always hogged the covers. And somehow those cramped nights felt safer than any quiet mansion ever could. Kerosene lamps flickered with warm amber light, shrinking rooms into tiny sanctuaries. They made stories feel heavier. They made secrets feel older. And when electricity wasn't guaranteed, that soft burning flame felt like the world choosing to stay awake for just a little longer. Quilts weren't stitched. They were built. Every square a memory from someone's dress, someone's Sunday shirt, someone's childhood curtain. You traced those seams with your finger like a map that led backward through family time. Those quilts didn't just warm your body, they held generations together. Root cellars were midnight treasure vaults. Cool dirt, jars stacked like soldiers on duty, glass fogged with winter breath. You'd lift that heavy wooden door and step into a quiet so deep, it made you whisper without knowing why. Records crackled like a campfire in the living room. Grandpa kept time with his foot. Couples swayed slowly on worn hardwood floors, careful not to scrape the finish. You didn't say good old days back then. You lived them in real time, one slow two-step at a time. Bibles weren't just books, they were heirlooms. Corners worn soft, pages dog-eared, notes scribbled in margins by hands long gone. When someone opened one, the whole room slowed down, because those pages didn't just hold scripture. They held family. Jigsaw puzzles sprawled across the kitchen table for days, always missing one piece. Yet nobody got angry. That final gap simply gave you permission to start again next weekend. Finishing wasn't the point. Doing it together was. Rag rugs by the door caught dirt, snow, dust, and memory. Worn thin in the center from thousands of footsteps, patched and repatched like lives that refused to quit. Even the floor knew the story of everyone who walked across it. And when summer nights finally arrived, you slept with windows open, praying for wind. Fans rattled and clunked just enough to move the air. Sweat dried slow. Crickets sang outside like the world's soft lullaby. And somehow, that imperfect peace was enough.